February 28th, 1998, a Saturday morning. A maintenance worker at an apartment complex in Leesburg, Virginia, knocked on the door of Unit 304. No answer. He knocked again. Nothing. Neighbors had complained about a smell coming from the apartment. The maintenance worker used his master key and opened the door. Inside, he found the body of a man in his late 60s lying on the floor. He had been dead for several days. There was no sign of foul play, no evidence of struggle. Just a man who had died alone in his apartment, apparently from natural causes. His body undiscovered until the smell alerted neighbors that something was wrong. The dead man was Arkady Shevchenko. 20 years earlier, he had been the highest-ranking Soviet diplomat ever to defect to the West. He had been Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, a personal protege of Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, a man who sat in meetings with the Politburo, who knew the deepest secrets of Soviet foreign policy. His defection in 1978 had been called the intelligence coup of the decade. His memoir, Breaking with Moscow, had been an international bestseller. He had commanded lecture fees of $10,000 per appearance. He had been famous, sought after, celebrated as a hero who had escaped tyranny to embrace freedom. And he died alone in a one-bedroom apartment in suburban Virginia with nobody noticing for days. The story of how Arkady Shevchenko went from Soviet elite to American defector to lonely death is one of the most tragic and complex tales of the Cold War. It's a story about privilege and disillusionment, about power and emptiness, about a man who discovered that the system he served was built on lies but found that the truth waiting on the other side was more devastating than liberating. And it began not with grand political awakening or ideological crisis, but with something as simple and mundane as walking into an American hardware store and realizing that everything he had been taught about the world was fundamentally, comprehensively wrong. Arkady Nikolaevich Shevchenko was born on October 11, 1930, in Horlivka, a coal mining city in eastern Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union. His father worked as an engineer in the coal industry, a position that placed the family slightly above the grinding poverty that characterized most of Ukraine in the 1930s. But only slightly. Arkady's childhood was defined by the standard deprivations of Soviet life in the Stalin era, compounded by the specific horrors that Stalin inflicted on Ukraine. The years 1932 and 1933 brought the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine deliberately engineered by Stalin's policies of agricultural collectivization. Millions of Ukrainians starved to death as Soviet authorities confiscated grain and food to feed cities and the Red Army. Horlivka, being an industrial coal mining center, fared slightly better than rural areas, but starvation stalked the streets nonetheless. Arkady's earliest memories were of hunger, of breadlines, of adults speaking in hushed, frightened voices about neighbors who had disappeared or died. His father's position as an engineer provided small privileges that meant survival. Access to the workers' cafeteria at the coal mine, occasional distributions of food through official channels. Enough that the Shevchenko family didn't starve, though they were never far from that possibility. Young Arkady learned early that survival in the Soviet system depended on position, on being inside rather than outside the official structures of power. Then came June 1941 and the German invasion. Horlivka fell under Nazi occupation within months. The next 2 years were a nightmare of occupation, resistance, collaboration, starvation, and violence. By the time Soviet forces retook Horlivka in 1943, the city was devastated, its population decimated, its infrastructure destroyed. Arkady was 13 years old and had lived through famine, occupation, and war. He had seen more death and suffering than most people experience in entire lifetimes. But from this crucible of suffering emerged something unexpected. Young Arkady was brilliant, exceptionally intelligent, driven, ambitious. He threw himself into his studies with intensity that impressed his teachers. Education was his path out of the ruins of Horlivka, away from the coal mines that had killed so many towards something better. He excelled in every subject, particularly languages. He learned English with remarkable fluency. He absorbed knowledge hungrily, desperately, as if education could build a wall between him and the poverty and violence that surrounded him. In 1949, at age 19, Arkady was accepted to the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, the most prestigious institution in the Soviet Union for training diplomats and foreign policy experts. This was an extraordinary achievement, a ticket to the absolute pinnacle of Soviet society. Acceptance to MGIMO meant you were destined for the elite. You would travel abroad. You would meet foreign leaders. You would shape Soviet policy. You would live with privileges ordinary Soviet citizens could never imagine. But admission to MGIMO required more than intelligence. It required absolute political reliability. The KGB vetted every applicant extensively, examining family background, political attitudes, personal associations. Any hint of disloyalty, any connection to suspect individuals, any deviation from orthodoxy meant rejection. That Arkady was accepted meant the KGB judged him reliable, trustworthy, a true believer in the Soviet system. And he was. Arkady believed everything he had been taught. The Communist Party had saved Russia from backwardness and exploitation. Stalin, despite his harsh methods, had been necessary to defeat the Nazis and build Soviet power. The Soviet Union represented humanity's future. Capitalism was dying, doomed by its internal contradictions. America was declining, corrupted by greed and inequality. These weren't propaganda talking points to Arkady, they were truth, as obvious and undeniable as gravity. At MGIMO, Arkady's brilliance and political reliability attracted attention from the highest levels. In 1954, he received his doctorate at age 24, an achievement almost unheard of. He was immediately assigned to work in the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Within a year, he caught the eye of Andrei Gromyko, who would become Soviet foreign minister and remain in that position for 28 years, making him one of the most powerful and enduring figures in Soviet politics. Gromyko recognized Arkady's talents immediately. Brilliant, fluent in English, politically reliable, hardworking to the point of obsession. Gromyko made Arkady his personal assistant, bringing him into the inner circle of Soviet foreign policy. By his mid-20s, Arkady Shevchenko was sitting in meetings with Politburo members, drafting policy papers on arms control and international relations, traveling with Soviet delegations to important negotiations. He was exactly where Soviet propaganda said a talented, hardworking citizen could rise to under socialism, at the very top. In 1963, Arkady married Lena Solomentseva, a beautiful, educated woman from a good family. They had a daughter, Anna. They lived in an apartment in Moscow that would have been considered luxurious by Soviet standards, though it would have seemed modest by Western middle-class measures. They had access to special stores where party elite could purchase imported goods unavailable to ordinary citizens. They attended receptions at foreign embassies. They vacationed at party resorts reserved for high officials. This was the good life in the Soviet Union, as good as life got for anyone, except perhaps the dozen men in the Politburo. In 1973, Arkady's career reached its pinnacle. He was appointed Under-Secretary General of the United Nations for Political and Security Council Affairs. This made him one of the highest-ranking Soviet officials in any international organization. More importantly, from the Soviet perspective, it gave them a spy at the very heart of the United Nations. Arkady would report everything back to Moscow. Who said what in private meetings, what strategies other nations were planning, what compromises might be possible. The United Nations was supposed to be neutral, but everyone knew the Soviets placed intelligence officers in UN positions. Arkady was one of the most important. The appointment meant moving to New York City. This was both opportunity and danger. Opportunity because New York was the center of the world, where Soviet diplomats could engage with their Western counterparts, where important decisions were made. Danger because New York meant exposure to the West, to American abundance, to ideas and information that contradicted Soviet propaganda. The KGB knew that exposure to Western life had turned many Soviet citizens against the system. They monitored all Soviet diplomats in New York constantly, looking for signs of ideological wavering. But Arkady seemed safe. He was 43 years old, a dedicated communist his entire life, a man who owed everything to the Soviet system. He had a wife and teenage daughter back in Moscow, which meant he couldn't defect without abandoning them to KGB vengeance. He was thoroughly vetted, constantly watched, deeply invested in his position and privileges. The KGB considered him reliable. They were wrong. Arkady arrived in New York in September 1973. He had been to Western countries before on diplomatic assignments, but always briefly, always under tight supervision, always in controlled environments. Living in New York was different. He maintained an apartment on Manhattan's Upper East Side. He shopped in American stores. He walked American streets. And despite decades of propaganda preparation, despite knowing intellectually that the West would look prosperous, nothing had prepared him for the reality of what he encountered. The abundance was overwhelming and everywhere. Grocery stores with quantities and varieties of food that seemed impossible. Clothing stores with styles and options beyond counting. Electronic stores selling consumer goods that didn't exist in the Soviet Union. Bookstores with tens of thousands of titles available to anyone who walked in. Restaurants of every type serving food from around the world. All of it open to ordinary people, requiring nothing but money, available without ration cards or party connections or waiting lists. The cars were what struck him first. Cars everywhere, private automobiles, thousands upon thousands of them, parked on every street, driving on every road. In Moscow, even high-ranking officials often didn't have personal cars. Arkady himself, Under-Secretary General of the UN, had access to a diplomatic vehicle but didn't own a private car. In New York, secretaries and shopkeepers and students had cars. The parking lots at shopping centers contained more private automobiles than existed in entire Soviet cities. But Arkady tried to rationalize what he saw. American propaganda, he told himself. Potemkin villages for foreigners. The stores in Manhattan were stocked to impress visitors, to hide the poverty that existed elsewhere. Americans were drowning in debt, mortgaged to banks, enslaved to credit cards. The abundance was fake, unsustainable, built on exploitation of workers and third-world countries. He had been trained his entire life to interpret Western prosperity through a Marxist lens, and that training didn't disappear simply because reality contradicted it. Then came the Saturday afternoon that would begin shattering his entire worldview. It was spring 1974. Arkady needed some basic items for his apartment. A colleague mentioned there was a hardware store in Queens, a large one, well-stocked. Arkady decided to go. He took the subway, which itself was an education. Despite Soviet propaganda about American urban decay, the subway worked. It was dirty and covered in graffiti and nothing like the spotless Moscow metro that Soviet propaganda loved to showcase, but it functioned. Trains ran frequently. Ordinary people used it to get around. It was infrastructure that worked despite being taken for granted. The hardware store was in a middle-class neighborhood in Queens, not Manhattan, not an area designed to impress foreigners or project American power. Just an ordinary commercial district serving ordinary people. Arkady walked into the store, and stopped, and stared. And later, much later, after his defection, he would tell CIA debriefers that he stood in the entrance of that hardware store and felt tears running down his face without being able to fully explain why. The store wasn't particularly large by American standards. It wasn't fancy or luxurious. It was just a regular hardware store, the kind that exists in every American city and suburb, the kind Americans don't think twice about. But to Arkady Shevchenko, it represented something so shocking, so fundamentally incompatible with everything he had been taught, that it broke something inside him. The shelves were stocked with tools, hammers in 10 different sizes and styles, screwdrivers in dozens of types, power drills from multiple manufacturers, saws, wrenches, pliers, every tool imaginable in multiple versions. The variety was incomprehensible. In Soviet stores, if tools were available at all, you bought whatever single option existed and considered yourself fortunate. Here were choices, dozens of choices for every function. Paint. An entire aisle of paint in hundreds of colors and finishes. In the Soviet Union, if you could find paint at all, it came in maybe 3 or 4 colors, usually poor quality, often requiring connections to obtain. Here was a rainbow available to anyone, no rationing, no limits. Nails, screws, bolts, fasteners of every conceivable type in bins and boxes. Lumber cut to standard sizes and stacked neatly. Electrical supplies, plumbing supplies, gardening supplies, household items, cleaning products. Everything a person might need to maintain or improve their home, all in one place, all available for purchase, all simply sitting on shelves waiting for customers. But what broke Arkady wasn't just the abundance of goods, it was watching the customers. Ordinary working-class Americans, people who would be considered proletariat in Marxist terms, walking through the store and casually purchasing whatever they needed. A man in work clothes bought an electric drill, a sophisticated tool that Soviet factory workers would have to requisition through official channels after weeks of paperwork. A young couple bought paint and brushes to redecorate their apartment, exercising aesthetic choices that Soviet citizens couldn't imagine. An older woman bought gardening supplies because apparently ordinary Americans had yards and gardens where they grew flowers for beauty rather than vegetables for survival. The customers weren't nervous or grateful or careful. They were casual, almost bored. This abundance was normal to them. They took it for granted. Some of them complained about prices or quality, expressing dissatisfaction with goods that exceeded anything available in the Soviet Union. They had been so saturated in abundance that they no longer valued it properly. Arkady bought some basic items he had come for, hammers and nails and light bulbs. The transaction was unremarkable. The cashier barely looked at him, processed his payment efficiently, moved on to the next customer. No questions about who he was or why he needed these items. No checking of identification, no ration cards. Just commerce, simple and functional. He left the store carrying a bag with his purchases. He stood on the sidewalk in Queens in spring sunshine, watching ordinary Americans go about their ordinary lives. And he understood, suddenly and completely, that everything he had been taught his entire life was a lie. Not exaggerated, not partially true with complications, not propaganda with kernels of fact. A lie, a comprehensive, systematic, deliberate inversion of reality. The Soviet propaganda he had believed his entire life said that capitalism exploited workers while socialism served them. But here were American workers living with a material abundance that Soviet party elite couldn't match. The propaganda said American wealth was concentrated among a tiny elite while masses suffered. But here were ordinary working-class people casually purchasing goods in varieties that Soviet generals couldn't access. The propaganda said capitalism was inefficient and chaotic. But here was a system that produced such abundance that people took it for granted, that stocked stores in ordinary neighborhoods with quantities and varieties that Soviet central planning couldn't achieve. Most devastating of all, this hardware store in Queens wasn't designed to impress anyone. It wasn't a Potemkin village built for foreign visitors. It wasn't propaganda. It was simply ordinary American commercial life, unremarkable and everyday, serving working-class people in a middle-class neighborhood. Which meant the abundance was real. Which meant the Soviet system had failed so completely that ordinary Americans lived better than Soviet elite. Which meant that his entire life had been built on lies. Arkady didn't defect that day. The decision would take 4 more years and would be complicated by factors beyond simple ideology. But something inside him broke in that hardware store in Queens. Some fundamental belief in the system he served shattered and could never be repaired. He went back to his apartment in Manhattan and sat in darkness for hours, unable to articulate what he was feeling, unable to unknow what he now knew. Over the following months and years, more observations accumulated, each one reinforcing the unbearable conclusion. Americans complained about their lives constantly, yet by any objective measure, ordinary Americans lived with comfort and security that Soviet propaganda insisted was impossible under capitalism. The homeless people in New York, held up by Soviet propaganda as evidence of capitalist failure, had access to shelters and services that didn't exist for ordinary Soviet citizens, let alone Soviet homeless. The poverty that definitely existed in America was still less desperate than ordinary life in much of the Soviet Union. The information available in America was equally shocking. Bookstores sold books criticizing the American government, analyzing its failures, proposing radical alternatives. Newspapers published investigations of government corruption and incompetence. Television news covered protests and dissent. The government made mistakes, sometimes terrible ones, and the media reported them freely. Citizens criticized their leaders publicly without fear of arrest. In the Soviet Union, such openness was not just impossible but unimaginable. All information was controlled. All criticism was prohibited. All dissent was punished. The system claimed to serve the people but couldn't tolerate the people questioning whether that service was effective. A government truly confident in its legitimacy wouldn't need such comprehensive information control. But the Soviet government was terrified of its own citizens, learning the truth about how much better life was in the West. Arkady's position at the United Nations gave him access to classified Soviet documents and policy discussions that revealed even more disturbing truths. Soviet foreign policy, sold to the Soviet people as defending peace and supporting liberation movements, was cynically manipulative and often brutal. Soviet arms control positions were propaganda stunts with no intention of real disarmament. Soviet support for third world countries was about expanding Soviet influence, not helping the oppressed. Behind the rhetoric about peace and justice, Soviet leaders pursued power with the same cynicism Arkady would have attributed to American imperialists. But the most devastating realization was personal. Arkady understood that he had dedicated his entire life to serving a lie. His brilliant career, his important position, his access to power, all of it had been in service of a system built on comprehensive deception. He had lied to himself and participated in lying to others. He had helped maintain the propaganda apparatus that kept hundreds of millions of people imprisoned in a failing system. His own success was evidence of the system's corruption, because he had risen not by serving truth or the people, but by serving the party and its lies. The psychological weight became crushing. Arkady started drinking heavily, using alcohol to numb the cognitive dissonance between his public position and his private knowledge. He had an affair with Judy Chavez, a young American woman whom he met in Washington. The relationship was passionate and reckless, a way to feel something real in a life that increasingly felt like performance. The KGB suspected his growing disloyalty but couldn't prove anything concrete. They increased surveillance, hoping to catch him in an act of betrayal. By late 1977, Arkady had made his decision. He would defect. He would request asylum in the United States. He would tell everything he knew about Soviet foreign policy and UN operations. He understood what this meant. His wife Lena and daughter Anna back in Moscow would face terrible consequences. He would never see them again. He would be branded a traitor, his name cursed in the country where he had been famous. Everything he had built would be destroyed. But he couldn't continue serving a lie. The hardware store in Queens had shown him a truth he couldn't unsee. The abundance, the casual freedom, the ordinary prosperity of working-class Americans had revealed that the Soviet system was comprehensively bankrupt. Continuing to serve that system would mean dedicating the rest of his life to perpetuating a massive deception. He couldn't do it anymore. In April 1978, Arkady Shevchenko made his move. He contacted the CIA and requested a meeting. The meeting was arranged with elaborate security precautions. Arkady told the CIA officer he wanted to defect. He would provide everything he knew about Soviet operations at the United Nations, Soviet foreign policy, Soviet arms control strategy, everything. In exchange, he wanted asylum, protection, and financial support. The CIA immediately recognized the intelligence windfall. Arkady was the highest-ranking Soviet official ever to defect. His knowledge was extraordinarily valuable. Within days, arrangements were made. On April 6, 1978, Arkady Shevchenko publicly requested political asylum in the United States. The story dominated international news. The Soviet Union was humiliated and furious. The KGB scrambled to contain the damage and took immediate vengeance on Arkady's family. Lena and Anna were in New York with Arkady when he defected. The KGB immediately contacted them, using a combination of threats and appeals to family loyalty. They told Lena that Arkady had been corrupted by Western decadence, that he had betrayed his country and family, that the only way to salvage anything was for Lena and Anna to return to Moscow immediately. Lena, loyal to the Soviet system and devastated by her husband's betrayal, agreed. She and Anna flew back to Moscow, where they were taken to a debriefing center. On May 10, 1978, just a month after Arkady's defection, Soviet authorities announced that Lena Shevchenko had committed suicide in her Moscow apartment. The official story was that she took an overdose of sedatives, distraught over her husband's betrayal. Some Western observers suspected the KGB had murdered her, either as punishment for Arkady or to prevent her from revealing embarrassing information. Anna, Arkady's daughter, would later say she believed her mother genuinely took her own life, unable to bear the shame and isolation that came from being the wife of the highest-ranking Soviet defector. The news of Lena's death devastated Arkady. Whatever complicated mix of emotions had driven his defection, whatever failures existed in his marriage, he had never intended for Lena to die. The KGB ensured he understood that his decision had killed her. His daughter Anna, still in the Soviet Union, refused all contact with him. He had betrayed his family, his country, everything and everyone he had known. And for what? To tell the CIA things they largely already suspected? To write a memoir? To live in the West? The psychological burden became overwhelming. Arkady threw himself into his work with the CIA, providing extensive debriefings on Soviet operations. He wrote Breaking with Moscow, published in 1985, which became an international bestseller. The book provided extraordinary detail about the inner workings of Soviet foreign policy and the cynicism at the heart of Soviet diplomacy. It was valuable and important work, genuine contribution to Western understanding of the Soviet system. But Arkady's personal life collapsed. His relationship with Judy Chavez ended badly, devolving into financial disputes that became public and embarrassing. He tried to build a new life in America but found himself isolated and rootless. The other Soviet defectors he met often struggled with similar problems, caught between worlds, belonging nowhere. Americans welcomed him as a symbol of freedom, but didn't understand the psychological weight of betraying everything you once believed in, even when that belief was founded on lies. The drinking got worse. Arkady would attend speaking events and lectures, commanding high fees for his appearances, giving polished presentations about Soviet deception, and the importance of Western vigilance. Then he would return to his apartment alone and drink until he passed out. The contradiction between his public persona as triumphant defector and his private reality as isolated alcoholic grew unbearable. The friends he tried to make often couldn't relate to his experiences. Americans who embraced him as a hero couldn't understand the guilt, the loss, the sense that he had destroyed his own life even though his defection was morally justified. Other Russian émigrés were suspicious, knowing he had once been high-ranking KGB-connected elite. He existed in a social limbo, neither fully American nor any longer Russian, carrying secrets and traumas that made genuine connection almost impossible. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Arkady experienced another wave of complicated emotions. His defection had been vindicated. Everything he had said about the system being unsustainable and corrupt was proven true. The West had won the Cold War. Capitalism had defeated communism. Democracy had triumphed over totalitarianism. He should have felt validated, triumphant, proven right. Instead, he felt empty. His betrayal had contributed nothing significant to that victory. The Soviet Union had collapsed under its own contradictions, not because of anything defectors revealed. His sacrifice of family and identity had been unnecessary. He could have waited a few more years and the system would have fallen anyway, and he would still have had his daughter, and Lena might still be alive. The drinking intensified. Friends and colleagues noticed Arkady becoming increasingly withdrawn and bitter. He moved from apartment to apartment, unable to settle anywhere, unable to build anything permanent. The lecture invitations became less frequent as the Cold War receded into history and Americans lost interest in Soviet defector stories. His book sales declined as newer events captured public attention. By the mid-1990s, Arkady was living alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Leesburg, Virginia, a suburban community outside Washington, D.C. He had some money from his book royalties and lecture fees, enough to live modestly. He had no close relationships, no family, no real purpose. He drank heavily, trying to numb the depression that had become constant. The man who had once sat in meetings with the Politburo, who had been famous internationally, who had defected in a blaze of publicity and principle, was dying slowly of loneliness and alcoholism in suburban America. On February 28, 1998, Arkady Shevchenko died in his apartment at age 67. The medical examiner determined the cause was a heart attack, likely brought on by years of heavy drinking and the stress of chronic depression. He had been dead for several days before anyone noticed. There was no one to miss him, no one checking on him regularly, no one who noticed his absence from daily life. The obituaries were respectful but brief. Arkady Shevchenko, highest-ranking Soviet diplomat ever to defect, dead at 67. The articles recounted his defection, his book, his intelligence value to the West. They mentioned the tragedy of his wife's suicide. A few noted that he had struggled with alcoholism in his later years. Then the news cycle moved on to other stories, and Arkady was forgotten by everyone except a few intelligence historians and Russian émigrés who remembered when his defection had been shocking news. Anna, his daughter in Russia, learned of his death through news reports. She did not attend any memorial service. She had never forgiven him for abandoning the family and indirectly causing her mother's death. Whatever complex motivations had driven his defection, whatever truths he had tried to expose, Anna saw only betrayal and abandonment. She wanted nothing to do with his memory. The Leesburg apartment complex held a small ceremony to dispose of his belongings. There wasn't much. Some books, some clothes, a few files with notes for writing projects he had never completed. The landlord boxed everything up and stored it temporarily before eventually throwing most of it away when no one claimed it. The apartment was cleaned, repainted, and rented to new tenants who had no idea of the previous occupants' extraordinary history. The story of Arkady Shevchenko is often presented as a triumph of freedom over tyranny, a tale of a brave man who risked everything to expose the truth about Soviet evil. And in some ways, that narrative is accurate. He did expose important truths about Soviet deception. He did provide valuable intelligence to the West. He did risk and lose everything to act according to his conscience once his eyes were open to reality. But the full story is more complicated and more tragic. Arkady's defection didn't bring him freedom or peace. It brought isolation, guilt, alcoholism, and a lonely death in a suburban apartment where no one noticed his absence for days. The truth he discovered in that hardware store in Queens, the truth that shattered his belief in the Soviet system, was devastating not just because it revealed Soviet lies, but because it revealed that his entire life had been built on those lies. He had been a true believer. He had dedicated his formidable intelligence and abilities to serving what he thought was humanity's best hope for justice and equality. When he discovered it was all lies, he couldn't simply walk away and start fresh. The psychological damage was too deep. He had helped perpetuate the lies for decades. He had risen to the top of a corrupt system and benefited from privileges built on the suffering of ordinary Soviet citizens who couldn't access hardware stores with abundance or make choices about paint colors or buy power drills without party connections. The hardware store in Queens that made him cry wasn't just showing him American prosperity, it was showing him the comprehensive failure of the system he had served. Every item on those shelves, every casual customer making purchasing decisions, every ordinary transaction was evidence that everything he had believed and worked for was bankrupt. The tears weren't joy at discovering Western abundance. They were grief for a wasted life in service of lies. American intelligence valued him for the secrets he brought, but they didn't understand or couldn't address the psychological devastation that came with those secrets. You can't defect from your own past. You can't unlive years of believing lies and serving evil while thinking you were serving good. That knowledge corrodes identity itself, leaving nothing stable or certain. Arkady tried to build a new life but couldn't escape the wreckage of his old one. The Soviet Union died in 1991, collapsing under its own contradictions just as Arkady had foreseen. The system proved unable to compete economically with the West, unable to satisfy its citizens' basic needs, unable to maintain legitimacy once enough people understood the truth. In the end, the Cold War was won not through military confrontation, but through the simple fact that capitalism, for all its flaws, produced hardware stores in Queens where ordinary people could choose from dozens of types of hammers, while socialism produced chronic shortages and waiting lists for basic goods. But that victory came too late for Arkady Shevchenko. He had recognized the truth in 1974, standing in that hardware store with tears running down his face, understanding that his entire worldview was collapsing around him. He had tried to do something about it by defecting and exposing Soviet lies. But the price was everything and everyone he had known. And the reward was lonely years in a culture that celebrated him as a symbol, but couldn't offer the human connection he desperately needed. When maintenance workers found his body in that Leesburg apartment, they found no family photos, no personal mementos, no evidence of close relationships or community connections. They found files and books and empty bottles, the detritus of a man who had lost everything and found nothing to replace it. A man who had glimpsed truth and discovered it was more devastating than the lies, because the lies at least had provided purpose and identity, while the truth offered only the certainty that he had wasted his life. The KGB files on Arkady Shevchenko, released decades later after the Soviet collapse, revealed that they had considered trying to assassinate him after his defection, but decided against it. Better to let him live, they reasoned, and spread rumors about his drinking and his troubled personal life. A defector who died mysteriously might become a martyr. A defector who drank himself to death alone in an American apartment would become an object lesson about the emptiness of betraying the motherland, even for mercenary traitors rather than principled truth-tellers. In that sense, the KGB won after all. They couldn't silence Arkady or prevent his revelations, but they didn't need to. His lonely, alcoholic decline and death provided its own propaganda value. Look what happens when you betray everything for Western materialism. Look how empty that life becomes. Look how America welcomes you as a symbol, but lets you die alone and forgotten. But that propaganda missed the deeper tragedy. Arkady didn't defect for materialism. He defected because a hardware store in Queens showed him that ordinary Americans lived better than Soviet elite, which meant everything he had been taught was lies, which meant his entire life had been in service of a comprehensive deception. That realization was what destroyed him, not the defection itself. The tears in the hardware store weren't tears of joy at discovering abundance. They were tears of grief for a life built on lies, tears of rage at decades of deception, tears of despair at understanding that there was no way to reclaim the wasted years or repair the damage done. Those tears were the beginning of the end of Arkady Shevchenko's life, even though he would live another 24 years. Everything after that moment was denouement, a slow decline from the shattered certainty of that spring afternoon in Queens to the lonely death in Leesburg. The hardware store is still there, though under different ownership now. It remains an ordinary hardware store serving an ordinary neighborhood in Queens. The customers who shop there today have no idea that more than 40 years ago, a Soviet diplomat stood in their aisles and cried while his worldview collapsed around him. They buy their hammers and paint and power tools with the same casual disregard that so shocked Arkady Shevchenko, taking for granted an abundance that half the world still can't access. And somewhere in a cemetery in Virginia, there is a small grave marker for Arkady Nikolaevich Shevchenko, 1930-1998. Most people who pass it have no idea who he was or what he did or what he sacrificed and lost. His story has faded into history, remembered mainly by intelligence specialists and Cold War historians, a footnote in the larger narrative of how the Soviet Union collapsed and America won. But the truth that broke Arkady Shevchenko in that hardware store remains true. Systems built on lies eventually collapse under their own contradictions. People cannot indefinitely be denied basic goods while being told they live better than those who have abundance. Reality eventually penetrates even the most comprehensive propaganda. And when that penetration happens, when someone raised on lies suddenly encounters truth, the psychological impact can be devastating beyond recovery. Arkady Shevchenko saw the truth, and it destroyed him. He tried to act on that truth by defecting and exposing Soviet deception, but he couldn't escape the damage that truth had done to his identity and sense of meaning. He lived his final years as a ghost, neither Soviet nor American, belonging nowhere, haunted by the waste of his first life and unable to build a meaningful second one. The Cold War ended. Democracy triumphed. Capitalism proved more effective than socialism at providing material abundance. But for Arkady Shevchenko personally, none of that mattered. He died alone in suburban Virginia, unmourned and quickly forgotten. His extraordinary story reduced to a few paragraphs in obituaries that most people skipped past on their way to more current news. That lonely death was the final price of truth for a man who spent most of his life serving lies. The hardware store in Queens showed him reality, but reality offered no redemption, no peace, no path forward that could repair what decades of deception had broken. Truth set him free, but freedom without identity or purpose or connection turned out to be just another form of prison. And in that prison, Arkady Shevchenko served out his remaining years until death finally offered the only release available to a man caught permanently between two worlds and at home in neither.